royal commissions for the prevention of baby farming. Stone houses make stony hearts, the Russian peasants say, but he ought to live in a stone house first. Similar remarks must be made as regards cannibalism, taking into account all the facts which were brought to light during a recent controversy on this subject at the Paris Anthropological Society, and many incidental remarks scattered throughout the savage literature. We are bound to recognize that practice was brought into existence by sheer necessity, but that it was further developed by superstition and religion into the proportions it attained in Fiji or in Mexico. It is a fact that until this day many savages are compelled to devour corpses in the most advanced state of putrefaction, and that in cases of absolute scarcity some of them have had to disinter and to feed upon human corpses, even during an epidemic. These are ascertained facts. But if we now transport ourselves to the conditions which man had to face during the glacial period, in a damp and cold climate, with but little vegetable food at his disposal, if we take into account the terrible ravages which scurvy still makes among underfed natives, and remember that meat and fresh blood are the only restoratives which they know, we must admit that man, who formerly was a granivorous animal, became a flesh-eater during the glacial period. He found plenty of deer at that time, but deer often migrate in the Arctic regions, and sometimes they entirely abandon a territory for a number of years. In such cases his last resources disappeared. During like hard trials, cannibalism has been resorted to even by Europeans, and it was resorted to by the savages. Until the present time they occasionally devour the corpse of their own dead. They must have devoured then the corpses of those who had to die. All people died, convinced that by their death they were rendering a last service to the tribe. This is why cannibalism is represented by some savages as of divine origin, as something that has been ordered by a messenger from the sky, but later on it lost its character of necessity and survived as a superstition, and meat had to be eaten in order to inherit their courage, and at a still later epoch the enemy's eye or heart was eaten for the same purpose, while among other tribes already having a numerous priesthood and a developed mythology, evil gods thirsty for human blood were invented, and human sacrifices required by the priests to appease the gods. In this religious phase of its existence, cannibalism attained its most revolting characters. Mexico is a well-known example, and in Fiji, where the king could eat any one of his subjects, we also find a mighty caste of priests, a complicated theology. W. T. Pritchard, Polynesian Reminiscences, London 1866, page 363, and a full development of autocracy. Originated by necessity, cannibalism became at a later period a religious institution, and in this form it survived long after it had disappeared from among tribes which certainly practiced it in former times, but did not attain the theocratical stage of evolution. The same remark must be made as regards infanticide and the abandonment of parents. In some cases they also have been maintained as a survival of olden times, as a religiously kept tradition of the past. I will terminate my remarks by mentioning another custom which also is a source of most erroneous conclusions. I mean the practice of blood revenge. All savages are under the impression that bloodshed must be revenged by blood. If anyone has been killed, the murderer must die. If anyone has been wounded, the aggressor's blood must be shed. There is no exception to the rule, not even for animals. So the hunter's blood is shed on his return to the village when he has shed the blood of an animal. That is the savage's conception of justice, a conception which yet prevails in Western Europe as regards murder. Now when both the offender and the offended belong to the same tribe, the tribe and the offended person settle the affair. It is remarkable, however, that in case of a sentence of death, nobody will take upon himself to be the executioner. Everyone throws his stone, or gives his blow with the hatchet, carefully avoiding to give a mortal blow. At a later epoch, the priest will stab the victim with a sacred knife. Still later it will be the king, until civilization invents the hired hangman. See Bastian's deep remarks upon this subject in Der Mensch in der Geschichte, 3rd Die Blue Track, pages 1 to 36. A remainder of this tribal habit, I am told by Professor E. Nice, has survived in military executions till our own times. In the middle portion of the 19th century, it was the habit to load the rifles of the 12 soldiers called out for shooting the condemned victim with 11 ball cartridges and 1 blank cartridge. As the soldiers never knew who of them had the latter, each one could console his disturbed conscience by thinking that he was not one of the murderers. But when the offender belongs to another tribe, and that tribe for one reason or another refuses a compensation, then the offended tribe decides to take the revenge itself. Primitive folk so much consider everyone's acts as a tribal affair, dependent upon tribal approval, that they easily think the clan responsible for everyone's acts. Therefore the due revenge may be taken upon any member of the offender's clan or relatives. In Africa and elsewhere too, it is a widely spread habit that if a theft has been committed, the next clan has to restore the equivalent of the stolen thing, and then look itself for the thief. A. H. Post, Africanist Jurisprudence, Leipzig, 1887, Volume 1, page 77. It may often happen, however, that the retaliation goes further than the offense. In trying to inflict a wound, they may kill the offender or wound him more than they intended to do, and this becomes a cause for a new feud, so that the primitive legislators were careful in requiring the retaliation to be limited to an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and blood for blood. See Professor M. Kovalevsky's Modern Customs and Ancient Law (Russian), Moscow 1886, Volume 2, which contains many important considerations upon this subject. It is remarkable, however, that with most primitive folk like thuds are infinitely rarer than might be expected, though with some of them they may attain abnormal proportions, especially with mountaineers who have been driven to the highlands by foreign invaders, such as the mountaineers of Caucasia, and especially those of Borneo, the Dayaks. With the Dayaks, we were told lately, the feuds had gone so far that a young man could neither marry nor be proclaimed of age before he had secured the head of an enemy. This horrid practice was fully described in a modern English work. See Colbuck, The Head Hunters of Borneo, London, 1881. I am told, however, by Sir Hugh Law, who was for a long time governor of Borneo, that the head hunting described in this book is grossly exaggerated. Altogether, my informant speaks of the Dayaks in exactly the same sympathetic terms as Ida Payfair. Let me add that Mary Kingsley speaks in her book on West Africa in the same sympathetic terms of the Fans, who had been represented formerly as the most terrible cannibals. It appears, however, that this affirmation was a gross exaggeration. Moreover, Dayak headhunting takes quite another aspect when we learn that the supposed headhunter is not actuated at all by personal passion. He acts under what he considers as a moral obligation towards his tribe, just as the European judge who, in obedience to the same evidently wrong principle of blood for blood, hands over the condemned murderer to the hangman. Both the Dayak and the judge would even feel remorse if sympathy moved them to spare the murderer. That is why the Dayaks, apart from the murders they commit when actuated by their conception of justice, are depicted by all those who know them as a most sympathetic people. Thus Colbuck, the same author who has given such a terrible picture of head-hunting, writes, "As regards morality, I am bound to assign to the Dayaks a high place in the scale of civilization. Robberies and theft are entirely unknown among them. They also are very truthful. If I did not always get the whole truth, I always got at least nothing but the truth from them. I wish I could say the same of the Malays." Pages 209 and 210. Buck's testimony is fully corroborated by that of Ida Payfair. "I fully recognize," she wrote, "that I should be pleased longer to travel among them. I usually found them honest, good and reserved, much more so than any other nation I knew." Ida Payfair, Men's Well Trades, when 1856, volume 1, page 116, sequence. See also Muller and Temminck's Dutch Possessions in Archipelagic India, quoted by Élisée Reclus in Géographie Universelle. 13th. Stolz used almost the same language when speaking of them. The Dyaks usually have but one wife, and treat her well. They are very sociable, and every morning the whole clan goes out for fishing, hunting, or gardening in large parties. Their villages consist of big huts, each of which is inhabited by a dozen families, and sometimes by several hundred persons, peacefully living together. They show great respect for their wives and are fond of their children, and when one of them falls ill, the women nurse him in turn. As a rule they are very moderate in eating and drinking. Such is the Dyak in his real daily life.